What if the oldest stories we know aren't myths, but survival guides coded in ritual, blood, and sacrifice? In this video, we dive deep into the story of Cain and Abel, a tale not just about jealousy, but about the birth of malevolence itself. Through ancient texts, psychological insight, and spiritual symbolism, we'll explore why sacrifice matters and why ignoring your shadow might make you dangerous. Because evil isn't out there, it's in here, and it's waiting.
You know when you want to really get something, grasp the core of it, but without drowning in details.
Yeah, avoid the overwhelm.
Exactly. That's what we're doing here. We take the source materials you give us, and we pull out the really key stuff.
It's like sifting for the gold, really.
Yeah.
Finding those crucial connections, the surprising bits, those moments that make you go, okay, I get it now.
So today we're diving into this really interesting lecture. It's called Sacrifice and Malevolence. And the source material is, well, it's pretty diverse. We've got these vivid descriptions of ayahuasca visions, all the way to, classic biblical stories like Abraham and Isaac, and then Cain and Abel.
Right, the foundational stuff.
Plus, we touch on things like the marshmallow test and the psychology behind that, and the invisible gorilla experiment. Ever heard of that one?
Oh, yeah, the one where you miss the obvious. Classic.
And this metaphor of deadwood as well. It's quite a mix.
So our mission then, for this deep dive, is really to unpack sacrifice. This lecture presents it in so many ways.
Yeah, looking at it psychologically, how it works in society, maybe even these deeper sort of archetypal levels.
Expect some twists, maybe a few surprises, things that might just click.
Okay, let's jump in. It starts actually in a pretty unusual place, with a letter.
Right, a letter from someone who'd been in an ayahuasca ceremony.
And what they took away from it is, well, it's intense.
The language they use to describe ayahuasca itself is fascinating, calling it she, the great mother of creation.
The goddess, the feminine counterpart of logos. Logos being, that idea of reason, order.
The underlying principle of things, yeah. It sets a very specific, almost mystical tone right away.
And the core message this person received, that the lecturer, Dr. Peterson, is apparently here to invoke and initiate the divine masculine principle on Earth at this time.
Which is quite a statement, especially coming out of that kind of experience.
It really underscores how personal and subjective these things can be.
Definitely. And what's interesting is how the lecturer immediately juxtaposes that, puts it right next to the story of Socrates.
Yeah. The Delphic oracle saying Socrates was the wisest because basically he knew nothing.
It seems like such a jump, doesn't it?
Totally. But the lecturer sees some kind of connection there. A bit tangential, maybe, as he says.
Perhaps something about humility. Or recognizing a wisdom beyond just what we think we know. It's a really thought-provoking start.
Okay, so from that sort of spiritual opening, we move to the main event. Sacrifice.
When you hear that word today, what usually comes to mind? For most people.
Probably giving something up now, hoping for something better later, right? Like discipline, working out.
Or what parents do for their kids. Huge sacrifices there. The lecture mentions immigrants, too, that experience often embodies sacrifice.
Definitely. Enduring hardship now for a shot at a better future for yourself or the next generation. That's the common understanding.
But then the lecture pivots to the Old Testament idea.
Yeah.
And that feels different.
Yeah, the lecturer notes how growing up, he never really connected that modern idea of sacrifice, self-discipline with the biblical stories. Cain and Abel, Abraham and Isaac.
They seemed like totally separate categories. Like offering an animal versus, say, studying instead of partying.
Nobody in Sunday school, at least for me, drew that explicit line.
And the lecture suggests this whole concept, delaying gratification, the idea of exchange, of sacrifice itself, probably emerged really early, maybe even before language as we know it.
Which brings us neatly to the marshmallow test, that famous study.
Ah, yes, the kids in the marshmallows.
Can you remind us how that works?
Sure. A child gets one marshmallow, they can eat it now, or if they wait, maybe 10 minutes without eating it.
They get 2 marshmallows later.
Exactly. And you can practically see the battle going on inside their little heads.
The lecture frames it as the prefrontal cortex, the planner, the impulse controller versus the more primal drives. The hypothalamus wanting that sweet, fatty goodness now.
And Walter Mischel, who ran those studies, found something really important.
Which was?
That the kids who could wait, who could delay gratification, tended to have better outcomes later in life. Higher test scores, better coping skills. It correlates strongly with conscientiousness, actually.
So that little struggle over a marshmallow, it's a miniature version of a fundamental human skill, the ability to choose the future over the present.
And the lecture directly links this psychological capacity to how he developed rituals and stories about sacrifice over time.
It's like through millennia of watching what works and what doesn't, humanity kind of figured out. Successful people, successful societies, they sacrifice, they delay gratification.
Which leads, almost inevitably, to a really big question.
The ultimate one, the lecture calls it. What is the greatest possible sacrifice for the greatest possible good?
It feels almost embedded in us, that question. What's the most profound way to give something up for a better collective future?
And that kind of ultimate question, the lecture argues, becomes archetypal. It's hard to think of a bigger, more fundamental question.
And it connects to this idea of a god, or gods, who require sacrifice.
Right. The god in the West, and many other traditions too, seems to demand it. We know the why is about giving up something valued.
But the lecture adds a twist. It suggests that sometimes the very thing you value most might be the source of your problems.
Ooh, okay. That's a challenging thought.
It's crucial, though. The idea is, if your reality isn't what you want it to be, maybe you need to look at your values, examine them.
And that examination, that willingness to question your core beliefs, that itself is presented as a kind of sacrifice.
Which flows perfectly into the invisible gorilla experiment.
Ah, yes. Such a great illustration of how focus can blind us.
Can you describe the setup?
Sure. People watch a video of two teams, white shirts and black shirts, passing basketballs. Your job is just to count the passes for one team, say the white team.
Simple enough task.
But while you're busy counting, someone in a full gorilla suit walks right into the middle of the scene, thumps their chest, and walks off.
And the kicker is?
About half the people watching completely miss the gorilla. They don't see it at all.
Because they're so focused on counting the basketball passes.
Exactly. The lecture uses this as a metaphor. Your ambition, your intense focus on one thing,
can make you totally blind to other, sometimes really important parts of reality, like a gorilla in the room.
So if things are going wrong, if you're suffering, maybe, just maybe, it's because you're fixated on the wrong point. You're counting the passes and missing the gorilla.
The takeaway being that we need to sometimes step back, question our focus, especially when things aren't working.
It could even mean letting go of something you really cherish, maybe a relationship or a goal, because it's actually the source of the chaos. That's a hard sacrifice.
But the core message, the lecture repeats it. If the world you are seeing is not the world you want, therefore, it's time to examine your values.
Instead of just, cursing fate or God or whatever, take some responsibility for your own perspective.
This idea of letting go of old patterns, old ways of seeing, it connects to the dead wood analogy.
Right, the phoenix myth first. The bird burns itself up to be reborn.
And then the connection to forest fires. Ecologically, small fires are necessary. They clear out the dead underbrush, the dead wood.
If that dead wood builds up too much,
You get a catastrophic fire later, wipes everything out.
and the parallel to personal life is pretty direct. If you don't deal with your accumulated problems, the unresolved stuff, the dead wood,
You risk a major burnout, a personal catastrophe.
the lecture even throws in that archetypal image of being eaten by the beast like a dragon if you let those problems pile up. It's a powerful visual.
Now, here's where it might seem a bit paradoxical. The lecture talks about the importance of actually acknowledging your suffering.
Even if the world is supposed to be, perfect or getting better.
Yeah, the logic is if things were perfect, then your suffering would be undeniable proof that something's wrong, wouldn't it? It uses Old Testament examples, like how widows and orphans, the most vulnerable, were considered incredibly important, even more than kings sometimes.
So it's about owning your own struggles, not pretending everything's fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because if you can't even admit you're having a hard time, how can you possibly start to fix anything, whether in your own life or in the world?
There's that stark anecdote about the person in the hospital elevator.
Right. Just got a terminal cancer diagnosis, and their immediate reaction is self-blame. Like, what did I do wrong?
The lecture isn't saying everything is your fault, necessarily.
No, it clarifies that. It's about fostering a general attitude of responsibility. Starting with yourself, looking at your own errors, your own contributions to the situation, before blaming everything else.
Which leads to that really potent phrase, sacrificing who you are for who you could become.
Letting go of the current, limited self to embrace potential.
And to show how hard sacrifice can be, especially giving up something immediate, there's the monkey track analogy.
Ah, yes. Tell us about that.
Okay, so imagine a jar, maybe weighted down with a narrow neck. You put some bait, like nuts or rice, inside,
Yeah.
and maybe some scattered around to attract the monkey.
So the monkey comes along.
Reaches into the narrow neck, grabs the treat.
But now his fist is clenched, right? It's too wide to pull back out through the narrow opening.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Even when the hunter or captor approaches, the monkey often won't let go of the treat.
It can't sacrifice the handful of rice for its freedom. It gets trapped.
It's such a powerful image for how we sometimes cling to small, immediate things, even when it puts our larger well-being at risk.
And the lecture draws this fascinating parallel, suggesting that these two ideas might be sort of equivalent. Something valuable given up ensures future prosperity, and something valuable sacrificed pleases the Lord. Like two sides of the same coin, reflecting this deep truth about sacrifice.
Which brings up the question, what's most valuable to sacrifice? Is there a hierarchy?
The lecture explores that. It starts basic, like with a choice cut of meat. Really valuable in hunter-gatherer times. Even chimps value sharing good meat.
Then it moves up, maybe sacrificing the best animal from your flock, a bigger investment.
And then this animal, the really profound ones, sacrificing yourself, or even harder perhaps, sacrificing your child.
Michelangelo's Pietà is mentioned here, capturing that immense weight of maternal sacrifice.
And this leads into a really thorny ethical area. The decision to bring a child into a world that clearly involves suffering. The lecture mentions a client grappling with this.
Yeah, and it addresses those common arguments against having kids. Too many people, we're ruining the planet.
It pushes back against those, calling them cliches sometimes, and points to things like the Club of Rome's predictions that didn't pan out, suggesting long-term doomsaying could be flawed.
Instead, it holds up Mary, the mother of Jesus, as an archetype. The woman who says yes to life voluntarily, knowing the suffering involved. It highlights the courage of mothers.
Contrasting her with a mother who might seem too agreeable, but still shows incredible strength through her constant giving.
Then there's the idea of reciprocal sacrifice. Christ offers himself.
And in the Christian Trinity, God the Father is simultaneously sacrificing his Son. There's a parallel drawn to Norse mythology, too, with Odin sacrificing himself to himself.
This is presented as the supreme sacrifice, the one that truly renews and redeems things.
And the opposite, the lecture argues, is a false sacrifice, something that leads to bad outcomes. It mentions an eatable catastrophe, maybe something tempting that leads to ruin. And the documentary Crumb, perhaps as an example of dysfunction.
The core point is that maternal, paternal, and filial child sacrifice seem necessary for things to go well in society.
And it emphasizes the deep, often unspoken value of that parent-child bond, the potential you see in a baby, which fuels these sacrifices.
So this all culminates in the idea of the truly archetypal sacrifice.
Yeah, the lecture argues the Christian story is archetypal because it's hard to imagine a greater sacrifice. The ultimate sacrifice is oneself and one's child.
And this connects back to that fundamental drive wanting to ease suffering, create a better future, which apparently requires sacrificing everything to God, interpreted as life or truth.
It's heavy stuff.
Definitely. And now the lecture shifts gears, using a specific story to explore these themes even more deeply. Cain and Abel.
Right. Described as incredibly profound, packed with meaning. And a key distinction is made right away.
Which is?
Cain and Abel aren't like Adam and Eve in paradise. They are the first human beings born into the world as we know it, the historical world, post-Eden.
And what happens almost immediately with these first historical humans?
Conflict, hostility between brothers, fratricide. These archetypal human patterns are right there at the dawn of history.
The lecture mentions the common hostile brothers archetype. Often the older one, Cain here, represents the status quo, maybe resistant to change, especially in farming societies where he might inherit the land.
While the younger, Abel, is sometimes seen as more balanced or adaptable.
And Eve's comment when Cain is born is highlighted, "I have gotten a man from the Lord," which makes it even more jarring that this first man born becomes a murderer.
So let's look at their offerings. Abel is a shepherd. That archetype suggests toughness, self-reliance, maybe care for the vulnerable.
He offers the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. Sounds like the good stuff, high quality.
Cain, on the other hand, is a farmer, a tiller of the ground. He offers fruit of the ground, just some produce.
And then the crucial part, God accepts Abel's offering, but not Cain's.
And the text is ambiguous about why, which the lecture notes is important. It leaves room for interpretation.
But Cain's reaction is immediate and strong, very wroth. the text says, really angry, and his countenance fell. He looks dejected, depressed, resentful.
Which is so relatable, isn't it? Feeling rejected or overlooked even when you feel you've worked hard.
The lecture connects this feeling, Cain's anger, his despair, to people whose lives just haven't turned out the way they hoped.
The example of Hitler is brought up again, someone with organizational skill, but driven by vengeful resentment, highlighting that this potential for destructive anger isn't unique to monsters. It can be in many of us.
And critically, the lecture says this Cain-Abel dynamic isn't just between people, it's within us. You're half and half. We all have both potentials.
This is where Jung's idea of the shadow comes in the dark, unconscious parts of ourselves. Cain becomes a kind of personification of that shadow. And the lecture, referencing Jung, suggests its roots go deep, maybe even to hell, not just metaphorically.
Okay, so God sees Cain's state, right, before the murder happens.
Yes, God asks him, basically, why are you so angry? And then poses that key question, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted?
Implying Cain wasn't doing well, something was off in his approach, his attitude.
The lecture uses an anecdote here about a bitter friend who was intellectually sharp but refused to adapt, clung to arrogance, and ultimately failed. An example of not doing well.
And there's that incredibly vivid analogy of the miserable person at the diner.
Oh yeah, actively making the experience awful through their own bitterness or resentment, criticizing the food, radiating misery, then blaming everyone else, the wife, the kids, God, the universe, actively creating a negative reality.
That's the state Cain is potentially in. And then God gives the warning.
If thou dost not well, then sin lies at your door. Sin here is interpreted as missing the mark. And this sin is described almost like a predatory animal crouching, waiting. The lecture uses this striking image. A sexually aroused cat predator thing.
Whoa.
Yeah. It connects this to Jung's idea of forming an unholy alliance with these negative impulses. Like conspiring with your own worst parts.
And sadly, this resonates with real-world examples like the Columbine killers or serial killers, who seem to consciously choose to cultivate their rage and plan revenge.
So Cain, already angry and resentful, is now basically told, it's your fault, and if you don't fix it, something terrible is waiting to pounce.
Probably didn't help his mood.
Likely made him even angrier.
Yeah.
And the next thing we know, he talks with Abel, they go out into the field, and Cain kills him.
The lecture then pulls back, offering an abstract summary from the speaker's own book, connecting Cain to Jesus' temptations.
It frames it as, Cain works hard, but is unhappy. Abel seems favored, maybe finds things easier. This breeds hatred in Cain.
There's another anecdote about brilliant Harvard students, and a sort of joke about how annoyingly perfect they seem, which ties into this.
The point being, Abel represents an ideal. And there's a real danger in cynically tearing down ideals, assuming anyone successful must be corrupt or got there unfairly.
That cynicism, that slaughtering your own ideal, the lecture argues, is incredibly self-destructive. It leads to bitterness, hopelessness.
It notes how rare genuine public admiration is now, often replaced by constant criticism.
So Cain goes down this path. Resentment, revenge fantasies, a kind of Luciferian arrogance, confronting his own inner darkness, described as Satan in the wilderness, echoing Milton.
And the key is that it's presented as a voluntary choice. Cain consciously chooses evil, malice.
The summary is brutal. The resentful, bitter failure taking an axe to the admirable success.
Then comes the aftermath. God asks the famous question, where is Abel thy brother?
And Cain gives that evasive, responsibility-dodging answer, I know not, am I my brother's keeper?
God's response is powerful. What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. The consequences are inescapable.
Cain is cursed, banished. The earth itself won't cooperate with him anymore. He's doomed to be a fugitive, a wanderer.
And Cain cries out, my punishment is greater than I can bear. The lecture interprets this not as God being mean, but as the natural, overwhelming weight of his actions. There's no easy way back from that.
He's terrified someone will kill him now.
And God puts a mark on him. Not necessarily to protect Cain out of kindness, but maybe, the lecture suggests, as an early attempt to stop endless cycles of revenge killing. A promise of sevenfold vengeance on anyone who harms Cain. Primitive law, perhaps.
And finally, the legacy of Cain. What comes from this?
Well, Adam and Eve find their son murdered. Cain truly confronts what he's done, his capacity for evil.
The lecture pauses here to note how strange it is that we dismiss the idea of evil today, given the 20th century, and argues if evil is real, then good must be too.
Cain then leaves God's presence, goes east, and builds the first city, Enoch, founded by a murderer.
And his descendants. They continue the pattern. Lamech, Jubal, and Tubal Cain.
Tubal Cain is specifically called out as the first maker of tools for war, weapons.
And Lamech brags about being even more vengeful than the protection offered Cain, 77-fold vengeance. The violence escalates exponentially.
It's such a dense story. The lecture uses it to show this deep human tendency to lash out, to destroy the good, both in others and ourselves, out of resentment and bitterness. Malevolence enters the picture as the enemy of proper sacrifice right after the fall into history.
Wow. Okay, so stepping back from that intense story, this deep dive really shows sacrifice isn't just one simple thing, is it?
Not at all. It's incredibly layered. From, everyday choices about delaying gratification right up to these huge archetypal narratives about life, death, good, and evil. It's woven into everything.
We've seen how it ties into responsibility, into how we deal with suffering, and this constant potential we seem to have for both creation and destruction, for good and, well, malevolence.
Yeah, it offers some really surprising ways to think about our own lives, our struggles, and maybe the bigger picture too.
So maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. How does this richer, maybe darker understanding of sacrifice change how you look at your own challenges or even societal problems?
What's the dead wood in your own life, perhaps?
You
What might need examining or letting go of for renewal?
Lots to chew on there. We really encourage you to sit with these ideas, maybe explore them further, perhaps even go back to the original lecture material itself.
Absolutely. Keep questioning, keep digging deeper.
Until our next deep dive, thanks for joining us.